Take your boy and disappear! I'm done wasting money on both of you!
Look at you. He upgraded his life and left the baggage behind.
Chairwoman, your board and aircraft are waiting for you.
Hook, take your divorce papers, Naomi said, pressing the folder back into her husband's hands. But before you leave your sick son at this gate, look through that window. Every plane wearing those colors belongs to me. Marcus Whitfield stared at her as if the woman he had married had disappeared, and someone far more powerful had stepped into her place. He had arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson with 2 attorneys, a new woman at his side, one-way tickets for his wife and child, and an emergency custody petition built from documents his mother had carefully selected. He believed Naomi had hidden money. He believed she needed his family name, his family accounts, and the billion-dollar Whitfield fortune to survive. He believed that by sunset she would be frightened enough to accept whatever terms he offered. He was wrong about all of it. Naomi Price Whitfield had quietly controlled Skybridge Airlines for 7 years. The $10 billion company had been built by her father, Solomon Price, one of the black aviation pioneers who fought for every gate, every route, and every loan before passing the company to the daughter he trusted most. Naomi had hidden her ownership to protect the airline from competitors and from the Whitfield family, whose investment firm had spent 18 months trying to buy it. Marcus never asked enough questions to learn the truth. Harriet asked many, but only about the company. With her own empire 8 weeks from a dangerous audit, she turned Sky Bridge into a rescue plan and used Jordan's illness, Marcus's fear, and family court as leverage. Her mistake was doing it at Gate D14, beneath Solomon Price's name, while his grandson still wore a hospital bracelet. This is the story of the day Naomi understood that silence was no longer protection. It was permission. Chapter 1, he left them at her own gate. Jordan Marcus Whitfield was 7 years old and still wearing his hospital discharge bracelet on his left wrist, a strip of white plastic with his name printed in block letters that Naomi had meant to cut off somewhere between Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and the departure level at Hartsfield-Jackson, but had ultimately decided to leave alone, partly because Jordan was half asleep, and she did not want to make him hold still, and partly because she had a private, irrational conviction that if she removed the bracelet before this morning was over, she would lose the last piece of evidence that the past 72 hours had been real. Some mornings you needed proof of what you had survived just to know you were still standing. He was in the back seat of Mr. Clarence's car, with his head tilted against the window and his paper airplane drawing in his right hand, a rendering he had made during the 2nd day of his hospital stay, when the inflammation in his joints had receded enough for him to sit up and ask for crayons. The drawing was detailed in the particular way of a child who takes his subject matter seriously. Swept back wings, a nose that curved just so, landing gear you could tell, had been attempted 3 times before it looked right. He had colored it in navy blue and old gold without anyone suggesting those colors, which were the colors of Skybridge Airlines, which were the colors of everything Solomon Price had built and left behind, which were, in ways Jordan could not have articulated, simply the colors that were his. Jordan opened his eyes as the car eased to the departure level. He looked at his drawing. He looked at the terminal building. He looked at his mother. "Are we at an airplane place?" he said. "Yes, baby. We're at the airport." He considered this with the slow thoroughness of a child who has spent 3 days in a hospital and is readjusting to a world that has more dimensions than a hospital room allows. "Whose airplanes?" "A lot of people's," she said. "Come on." He unbuckled his seatbelt before she could reach him, which was Jordan's way of saying that he was fine. He was capable. The hospital had not changed that. She helped him down from the car, anyway, and he did not object. which was as much concession as she was going to get from a 7-year-old with opinions about his own independence. She did not take his hand because he had recently informed her that holding hands in public was, and she was quoting him exactly, kind of embarrassing now. She had accepted this ruling with the solemn respect it deserved. She simply walked close enough that his shoulder brushed her arm every few steps, and he allowed it. And that was the compromise they had arrived at. The automatic doors of Concourse D opened, and the particular smell of Atlanta's airport in October came out to meet them, recycled air and coffee, and the faint industrial undertone that Naomi had known since before she was old enough to name it, since she was small enough to ride on Solomon Price's shoulders through terminals exactly like this one. She had been coming to this building since before she could read. She knew it the way you know a house you grew up in, not in your mind but in your feet, in the way your body navigates without asking for direction. She knew that the coffee cart near Gate 3 brewed stronger than the one near Gate 9. She knew that the light through the east-facing windows at this hour fell at an angle that made the bronze lettering at the far end of the concourse look like it was lit from within. She knew, without having to look, exactly where Marcus was standing. She looked anyway. He was at Gate 14 with 2 men in dark suits and a woman Naomi recognized immediately. Victoria Hale was 36, polished, ambitious, and recently promoted to lead the Sky Bridge acquisition team at Stokes Capital. She wore cream wool, carried a red leather portfolio, and stood close enough to Marcus that the space between them looked practiced. 6 weeks earlier, Naomi had found a late-night message on Marcus's phone that said, "I wish tonight had not ended." He had called it a mistake made during a difficult season. Victoria's hand resting briefly on his sleeve told Naomi the season had continued. Marcus wore a gray coat Naomi did not recognize, new and expensive, selected for a morning he expected other people to remember. The 2 men were attorneys. Victoria was not there because the law required her. She was there because Harriet wanted Naomi to see the life Marcus believed he was stepping into after ending theirs. They walked. Halfway down the concourse, coming toward them from the direction of Gate 1, was a man in a full Skybridge Airlines captain's uniform, navy jacket with gold-striped cuffs, 4 bars on the epaulette, the company emblem stitched in old gold over the breast pocket. He was perhaps 55, unhurried in the way of a man who has logged enough hours above the cloud layer that the ground has never fully reclaimed him. He looked up from his phone, registered the woman coming toward him, and straightened in the specific way of someone acknowledging the person who signed the contracts that determined his career. Not a bow, not performed, just the correct recognition of who was in the concourse with him, delivered with the compressed dignity of someone who understands this is not the moment to say so aloud. He gave her a nod. She gave one back. They passed. Jordan tugged her sleeve. "Mama, that man in the airplane suit knew you. He works with me sometimes." Jordan looked back at the captain, already moving away, and stored this information in the particular way he stored things, quietly, for later. The gate agent at Gate 11, a young woman named Brianna, who had been with Skybridge 14 months and knew exactly whose mother she was looking at, kept her eyes on her screen but sat up straighter as they passed. A ground crew technician in a Skybridge vest crossing at the far end of the concourse altered his trajectory slightly, not to approach but to give a kind of clearance, the instinctive courtesy of someone who knows, without being told, that certain people should have the space they need. Jordan looked at his mother. "Is this your airport?" "It's a lot of people's airport," she said. "Come on, baby." Marcus saw them when they were 20 feet away. Something moved in his face when he saw Jordan, something that had not been part of his preparation, something human and unplanned that he covered in under 2 seconds. Naomi watched him cover it. She filed it away. "Naomi," he said, Marcus. He looked at Jordan. Hey, bud. Jordan regarded his father with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of a child who has decided that adults are complicated and that the right response is to proceed with the people you love as though the complications belong to them and not to you. Hey, Daddy. I was in the hospital. They gave me stickers, but I lost one at the nurse's station. I heard you were there. His eyes touched the white hospital bracelet and moved away. The sentence he should have spoken was simple. I should have come. He did not say it. I'm glad you're feeling better. Jordan looked at him for a moment. You could have visited. They let parents come anytime. Marcus swallowed. Victoria lowered her eyes to the red portfolio. One of the attorneys studied the departure board. I had meetings, Marcus said, but I knew your mother was with you. Naomi felt something inside her become very still. He had not failed to understand. He had made a choice and arranged language around it. Jordan held up the drawing. I made this. It's a sky bridge, 737. I made the nose longer than the real ones because it looks better that way. Marcus looked at the drawing. Then he looked at Naomi, and behind his eyes something was turning, some gear engaging that he did not yet have the context to understand. She held her face open and gave him nothing. Marcus held out the manila folder. Victoria opened her portfolio at the same time and removed 2 boarding passes. Naomi took the folder. The separation agreement was first. It identified $2.3 million in marital assets and offered her a structured payout over 24 months if she waived any claim against the Whitfield family trust. The document described Marcus as the primary source of financial stability in the marriage. It described Naomi's consulting work as irregular. It did not mention the $10 billion airline whose payroll she had approved before sunrise. The next page informed her that access to the joint family accounts had been suspended pending financial review. Her household card had been frozen at 6 that morning. The driver assigned to Jordan's medical appointments had been canceled. The locks at the Buckhead house were scheduled to be changed at noon, although the house was legally marital property. Victoria placed the boarding passes on the table beside the folder. There is a flight to Washington at 11:40, she said in a voice designed to sound helpful. The tickets continue to Philadelphia tomorrow. Given Jordan's specialist needs, we thought it would be best for you to stay with relatives until the court reviews the situation. Naomi looked at the tickets. One way, economy class, purchased at 5:12 that morning by Stokes Capital Travel Services. You thought, Naomi said. Victoria's professional smile held. We are trying to reduce disruption. My son came out of the hospital 3 hours ago, which is exactly why stability matters, Marcus said. Naomi turned another page. The emergency temporary custody motion had been filed at 7:45 that morning in Fulton County Family Court. It claimed that Naomi's undisclosed financial interests created potential instability in Jordan's primary residence. It requested that Marcus receive temporary authority over medical decisions until Naomi provided a full asset disclosure. The language was careful. It turned suspicion into concern, control into protection, and a sick child into legal leverage. At the bottom was Marcus's signature. Naomi read it twice, not because she doubted what it said, but because 7 years of marriage deserved the dignity of certainty before she accepted that her husband had signed his name beneath it. Did your mother prepare this? She asked. Marcus looked offended by the question because offense was easier than shame. My attorneys prepared it after reviewing the records. That was not my question. The records came through the acquisition review, and you never called me. You have hidden accounts, Naomi. You have an LLC moving money under your maiden name. You have refused to explain where your income comes from. What was I supposed to think? You were supposed to ask your wife before asking a judge to take her sick child. The nearest attorney shifted his weight. Victoria looked toward the windows. Marcus lowered his voice. This does not have to become ugly. Sign the agreement. Disclose the accounts. Take some time away from Atlanta. Once the court understands what is happening, we can discuss a reasonable custody schedule. Jordan had been listening with the patient stillness children develop when adults forget they are present. He looked from the boarding passes to his father. "Are you coming to Philadelphia?" Marcus's face changed. For 1 second, Naomi saw the father he could still choose to be. Then he looked at the attorneys, at Victoria, and finally at the plan he had already committed himself to. "Not on this trip, bud. But Dr. Reeves is supposed to help me. Your mother will take you." Jordan looked down at his paper airplane. That was the moment Naomi stopped considering whether the marriage might still be saved. The betrayal was not the money, Victoria, or even the filing. It was the ease with which Marcus had removed himself from his son's fear and called the removal stability. She closed the folder. She looked at her husband, at his new coat, at the two witnesses carefully not looking at her, at the man she had married at the Biltmore on a Saturday in June with her mother in the front row, and Solomon Price's portrait on the program because he had been gone 4 years and could not be there in person. "7 years I kept your family's hands off what my father built," she said. 7 years, and the one place I did not protect myself was you." Marcus went still. Victoria's eyes moved toward the Skybridge aircraft outside the window. Naomi pressed the folder back into Marcus's hands. "Take your divorce papers. Take your one-way tickets. But before you leave your sick son at this gate, look outside. Every plane wearing navy and gold belongs to the company my father built." Marcus looked through the glass at 3 Skybridge aircraft lined along the concourse. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I am saying you chose the wrong building, the wrong gate, and the wrong woman to threaten with financial instability." She turned to Victoria. "The acquisition team will receive formal notice. Skybridge is not for sale." Victoria's face lost its professional calm. "You do not have authority to make that statement." Naomi looked at her with no anger at all. "By Tuesday morning, you will understand exactly how much authority I have." She looked back at Marcus. "The custody motion is withdrawn before we discuss anything else. That is not a negotiating position. Jordan's medical care continues without interference. The accounts you froze will be irrelevant before lunch." "Naomi, wait. You had 72 hours to come to the hospital. You had 7 years to ask me who I was. You used both opportunities to do something easier." She turned away. Marcus said her name once. She kept walking. She had taken 12 steps when Jordan, who had been standing beside her with his drawing and the patient containment of a child who has learned that adult conversations are weather systems you wait out, tugged the side of her jacket. She looked down. Jordan's face was doing the thing it did when he was working something out, a slight inward focus. "Clouds gathering," he said. "Mama, Daddy's going to the elevator." She looked. Marcus was at the elevator bank with Victoria and the 2 dark-suited men, the folder in his hand. He did not look back. The doors opened. He stepped through. They closed. Jordan watched the closed doors for a moment. Then he looked up. "Is Daddy going to his office?" "I think so, baby." He thought about this. The particular way he thought about things, unhurried, giving it the time it required, was something she had recognized in him since he was 3 years old. He said, he didn't say goodbye. Naomi crouched down to his level, right there in the middle of Concourse D, with the morning moving around them in both directions. She looked at her son's face, the strong brow and the serious eyes and the jaw he had gotten from Marcus, the way he held his paper airplane as though it were something worth protecting. She said, "Jordan, your daddy loves you. That is the part that stays the same, whatever else is changing." He looked at her steadily. He was deciding something, not what to believe, but how much to ask. He was 7 years old, and he understood that some questions are questions you are not ready for the answer to. He settled for, "Okay, one word. but the weight of how he said it, small and certain, the sound of a child deciding to trust his mother across a distance he could not fully see, was the closest thing that entire morning came to undoing her. She stood back up. She breathed once, then again. Jordan was already looking at something else. He had stopped walking, Mama, he said. She followed his gaze to the far wall of the concourse. The Solomon Price concourse placard was mounted at eye level for an adult, cast bronze, set into a stone surround, formal and permanent in the way of things that are meant to outlast the people who put them there. The letters were large enough to read clearly, Solomon Price Concourse, dedicated to the memory of the man who brought us home. Jordan read it with the focused lip movement of a child making sure he was getting it right. Then he looked at her. Solomon Price, he said carefully, both syllables of the last name given equal weight. The way you say a name when you understand it is important without knowing yet why. Mama, that's the same as your daddy's name. That's your grandfather's name, yes. Jordan turned back to the placard. He read it again. Then he looked down the concourse, at the gates, the moving walkways, the tall windows at the far end, where the morning light was coming in flat and gold across the tarmac. A Skybridge aircraft was pushing back from the jet bridge at Gate 2, turning slowly on the ground cruise signal, its livery catching the light. Navy blue and old gold. Jordan looked at the aircraft. He looked at his drawing. He held the drawing up beside the window, comparing. Mama, he said, I made mine the same colors as Grandpa's. She could not answer for a moment. She was looking at her 7-year-old son, holding a drawing he had made in a hospital room, standing under his grandfather's name in bronze. Holding the colors he had chosen for reasons he could not have named in a conversation with himself, he would never remember having. She was looking at this, and she was thinking of Solomon Price saying, Everything I build so it will still be standing when you need it. You did, she said. Did he like airplanes? He loved them more than almost anything. She looked at the placard one more time. He used to say that when a plane takes off, for just a few seconds, everything that's weighing you down has to stay on the ground. Jordan thought about this. That sounds nice, he said. It does, she said, and meant it. Desmond Okafor had come up on her left without disturbing anything, the particular skill of a man who has spent 11 years moving through a busy terminal as a professional in charge of keeping it running. He stood at the correct distance and waited. Ms. Price, he said. Her name, the right one. Mr. Clarence is at lower level Bay 7. Brianna called him up when you came through the doors. Thank you, Desmond. He looked at Jordan with the seriousness that children deserve and rarely receive from adults who are busy. That's real work, he said, nodding at the drawing. Jordan held it up. The nose is longer than a real 737 because it looks better. I decided that. You decided right, Desmond said. He looked at Naomi. One look, direct and brief, the compressed language of a community that has known what it knows and has been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. We're glad you're here, Miss Price. Anytime. In the elevator going down, Jordan leaned against her arm and said to the air in front of him, the way children address the universe when they are thinking out loud, I want to come back and look at the name again sometime. We'll come back, she told him. I promise. She took out her phone and called Howard Gaines. He answered before the second ring, which was unusual. He was a man who answered on the second ring because the first, he had always said, was for people with nothing better to do than sit beside their phone. I was expecting you, he said. They filed this morning. Emergency custody motion. The phrase they used is undisclosed financial interests. Howard was quiet long enough that she heard the sound of his chair shifting. Then he said, that is a businesswoman's language, not an attorney's. An attorney would say, non-disclosure of assets. Undisclosed financial interests is what you say when you know money is somewhere, you cannot see it, and you cannot name it. A pause. She has known something exists for some time. The not knowing what it is, that's what's making her move fast and ugly. The motion names Jordan. The motion uses Jordan, Howard said, with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years ensuring that language meant what it was supposed to mean. Harriet Whitfield does not want primary custody of a 7-year-old child in medical treatment. She wants you in a defensive posture for the next 90 days. A pause. You know what comes next. I need the ownership declaration package. Updated every January for 3 years, he said. I'll have it to Adeze Ose by 2 o'clock. He was quiet for a moment. Your father always believed this day would come. He said the quiet was for protecting the thing, not for living in forever. Another pause. The thing is protected. The quiet has done its work. Now you do yours. She sat with that as the car moved south toward Cascade Heights. Outside, Jordan had fallen back to sleep against the window, the drawing in his lap, the colors of his grandfather's airline still bright in the morning light. Chapter 2: What Harriet Was Really Afraid Of. Harriet Whitfield arrived at her office at 6:14, which was the time she had been arriving at her office since 1993, when she had 2 associates and a glass-walled room the size of a generous closet and a calendar full enough that 6:14 was the only hour in the day that was unambiguously hers. 30 years later, she had 41 employees, a floor and a half of Stokes Capitol Tower, and a view that took in the Buckhead Ridgeline to the east and the haze of the airport to the south. But she still came at 6:14 for the same reason she always had, to be alone with the numbers before the day had a chance to complicate them. She made her own coffee. Her assistant Phyllis arrived at 8 and would have made it if asked. But Harriet did not ask. There were certain small acts she protected from the encroachment of assistants because she believed, based on 3 decades of evidence, that the day you stop doing small things yourself is the day you begin to lose your grip on the large ones. She took the cup to the window and looked south. Somewhere in that direction, in a gray coat she had arranged for Marcus to have delivered to his office on Friday, her son was on his way to a terminal with a manila folder and 2 witnesses. She had not told him what to say. She had only ensured that by this morning he had the right information in the right sequence, delivered in the right way, so that the conclusion he arrived at felt like his own. This was how Harriet Whitfield had always worked, not by commanding, but by curating the landscape, so that the people she needed to move had no obvious path that did not lead where she intended. She had done this in business for 30 years. She had done it with Marcus since the night Gerald's car backed out of the driveway, and she looked at her 9-year-old son across a dinner table and understood that she was the only architect of his world now. She had built him well. She was proud of what she had built. Harriet was also carrying a deadline. In 8 weeks, Stokes Capital would face an audit that could expose a financial hole large enough to destroy the company she had spent 30 years building. 3 aggressive investments had pushed the firm beyond the limits promised to its lenders. Marcus still believed the business was secure because Harriet had spent nearly 2 years protecting him from the truth. Buying Skybridge was no longer an ambitious expansion. It was survival. The airline's $10 billion in aircraft, gates, property, and infrastructure could stabilize Stokes Capital before the audit. If the acquisition failed, Harriet would have to explain the missing strength in her balance sheet to her son, her board, and every investor who had trusted her name. 18 months of failed negotiations had brought her here. 3 days ago, she had gone to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. She thought about that visit now, standing at the window with her coffee, turning it over in the way you turn over something you have done and have not yet fully decided what to think about. Jordan had been in his room on the 4th floor, bored in the specific way of a 7-year-old who has been in a bed for 3 days and is running out of television he wants to watch. She had brought him a book about aircraft, real illustrations, not a picture book, because Jordan was the kind of child who noticed when you underestimated him, and she had always found that trait in him worthy of respect. He had shown her the paper airplane drawing he was working on. He had explained his reasoning about the nose extension. She had listened with genuine interest because she genuinely found the child interesting, and that was the truth alongside the other truth. And she was experienced enough to hold both without needing to choose. She had spoken with the attending nurse. She had introduced herself as Harriet Whitfield of the Whitfield Family Foundation, not as Marcus's mother, because Marcus's mother was a personal relationship, and personal relationships were warm, but they did not open administrative doors the way institutional relationships did. She had mentioned the foundation's annual grant to the Pediatric Symposium. She had expressed the natural concern of a family benefactor about the long-term care planning for a complex pediatric case. She had mentioned, as a casual reference, the work of Dr. Harold Reeves at Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia, work she had looked up specifically for this conversation because doing things correctly required preparation. The nurse had been attentive and responsive. Harriet had left. The seed was in the ground, and she had not needed to ask for anything specific, because the most effective asks are the ones that never sound like asks. At 9:17 on Monday morning, Marcus called from the airport. "Done," he said. Harriet heard voices behind him and the distant announcement of a departing flight. Did she sign? "No," she said. "Sky Bridge is not for sale." She said her father built it. For the first time that morning, Harriet stopped moving. "Come to the office. Bring Victoria." The plan had begun 3 days earlier. On Friday afternoon, Harriet had placed a folder on the conference table containing bank transfers across 3 years. 37 transactions totaling $1.4 million had moved through an account under Naomi Price into Bridge Consulting Services. The transactions were real. Harriet had not manufactured a number. She had selected the records, removed the payroll schedules, shareholder distributions, tax documents, and board authorizations surrounding them, and turned routine corporate management into a story about secret money. Victoria Hale had been in the room because she led the acquisition research. She was also there because Harriet understood that jealousy could finish an argument that evidence only began. Marcus and Victoria had crossed from professional intimacy into a personal relationship 6 weeks earlier. Marcus had not called it an affair because the word would have required him to see himself clearly. He called it comfort. Victoria called it timing. Harriet called it useful. Harriet had told Marcus, "I did not want to bring this to you." I looked for a reasonable explanation, but when the acquisition team found money moving under Naomi's maiden name, I could not ignore the risk to Jordan. Marcus studied the pages for 20 minutes. He could have called Naomi. He could have driven to the hospital. He could have asked why the company name contained the word bridge, or why airline executives greeted his wife at charity events. Instead, he looked at Victoria, who said quietly, "If she has nothing to hide, disclosure protects everyone." Harriet placed the proposed custody motion beside the records. "Your attorney can file Monday morning. Temporary medical authority only. It gives you leverage until she tells the truth." Marcus read the paragraph naming his son. He knew Jordan was in a hospital room. He knew Naomi had been awake for 2 nights. He also knew that asking his wife the truth might force him to confront how little he had wanted to know. "File it," he said. Harriet did not smile. Victory was most useful when it looked like concern. Now, after the airport, Marcus stood in her office with Victoria near the windows and repeated Naomi's words. "She said every navy and gold plane belongs to the company her father built," he said. Harriet recovered first. "Solomon Price had aviation interests. That does not make Naomi the owner of Sky Bridge. She is trying to frighten you because the filing worked." Victoria was no longer certain. She knew about the acquisition team. She addressed me as if she could terminate the process. "Then find out what she knows," Harriet said. "And Marcus, do not withdraw the motion because she made a dramatic statement in an airport." Marcus looked at his mother. "Jordan asked if I was coming to Philadelphia. Jordan is 7. You are his father, not his emotional employee. Do what protects him in the long term." Harriet poured coffee and told herself what she had done was necessary. She repeated the thought until necessity and truth felt almost like the same thing. That evening, Marcus drove to Children's Healthcare. Jordan had been discharged that morning, and the room on the 4th floor had been cleared and reset, bed remade, window cleaned. The small marks of Jordan's occupancy erased with the institutional efficiency of a place that has to make room for the next child. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment, registering the specific flatness of a space that was full and now is not. At the nursing station, the attending nurse from Jordan's case looked up when he signed in. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. "I wanted to flag Dr. Reeves's office at Jefferson reached out. They have an opening for Jordan in approximately 6 weeks. The referral came through the Skybridge Airlines Community Health Partnership." Marcus looked at her. He had not contacted Dr. Reeves. He had not provided his name to anyone. He was not familiar with the Skybridge Airlines Community Health Partnership in connection with anything to do with his son. "Which partnership is that?" he said. She turned her screen toward him briefly. "Skybridge Airlines has been a platinum partner with our pediatric division for 3 years. They fund a specialist referral network as part of their employee and community benefit program." She smiled. "Jordan will be well cared for with Dr. Reeves." She moved on to the next task. Marcus stood in the hallway with the particular quality of stillness that descends on a person when 2 separate facts have just landed next to each other and are beginning to do something he is not ready for. Skybridge Airlines. He went home, sat in the library with the folder and a glass of water he did not drink, and the silence of a house that had been reorganizing itself since Tuesday morning in ways he was only starting to understand were permanent. He picked up his phone. He went through his photos without a clear idea of what he was looking for, the way you go through a drawer when you are looking for something you cannot name. He found the picture by accident, which is how you find the things that matter. It was from 3 years ago. A charity gala at the Buckhead Intercontinental, one of several hundred photos from an evening that had blurred into the general texture of the life they had been building together. He had been trying to photograph a friend across a crowded room, and Naomi had ended up in the background of the frame, standing near a tall window in conversation with a man wearing an aviation industry conference lanyard. He would not have stopped on it except for how she was standing. He had 10,000 photographs of Naomi. He knew the catalog of the way she held herself up in the world, at dinner parties, at his business events, at their friends' celebrations. In the private moments he had caught when she did not know the camera was on her. He knew the range of how she occupied space. And the woman in this background, in this frame, was standing in a way he did not recognize from any of those 10,000 photographs. She was grounded in a way she never quite was in the social spaces they shared together, settled, authoritative, entirely at ease in a way that had nothing to do with the ease of a guest at a party. She was looking at the man across from her with the focused attention of someone who is doing something real, and he was looking back with the attention of someone who knows he is in the presence of someone significant. Marcus enlarged the photo. He could not read the lanyard. He could see through the window behind them, across the night cityscape, to the side of an office building where large dimensional lettering had been mounted with the permanence of a company that has been somewhere long enough to want people to know it. Bridge Holdings. He sat with the phone for a long time. He sat until the water was still untouched, and the folder was still open, and the library had gone fully dark around the circle of his phone's light. He was thinking about a placard he had walked under that morning at the airport without looking at. He was thinking about a referral form and a community health partnership and an LLC that appeared in his mother's folder with a name that was half his wife's name. He was thinking about what it meant that he had been in the same rooms as these facts for 3 years and had not once turned them over to look at what was underneath. He had not turned them over because it had been easier not to. He knew this about himself, sitting in the dark. In the specific and uncomfortable way you know things about yourself when there is no longer any arrangement of the room that allows you to look away from them. He called his attorney at 11 and asked what it would take to withdraw the motion he had ordered, filed that morning. The attorney told him withdrawal required a formal instruction and warned that reversing course before the first hearing would make him look manipulated. Marcus said he needed one night. It was another delay, and he knew it. At the kitchen table on Cascade Hills Road, Naomi was reading through Bridge Holdings materials when Camille set down her coffee and said, "The hospital flagged something for a Daisy this afternoon." Mrs. Whitfield was in Jordan's room 3 days ago. She sat with him for 40 minutes. She spoke with the nursing staff about pediatric specialist programs. Naomi set the papers down. She put both palms flat on the table. She breathed. "She sat with my son," Naomi said. "Yes, in his hospital room. Yes." Miss Eugenia put down her crossword pencil. She looked at her daughter once, with the look of a woman who has seen enough of the world to recognize the shape of a thing when it is standing in front of her, and who is waiting to see what her daughter will do with the recognition. "The fourth quarter audit," Naomi said. "Camille, when is it due?" 8 weeks. Naomi picked the papers back up. "Call Adiz tonight. I need the FA declaration package on my desk Thursday morning." Chapter 3, the woman he never bothered to know. The 19th floor of the building at Peachtree and 15th had no company name on the elevator bank, no logo in the lobby glass, no identifying signage except a single word in small frosted letters on the interior doors: Holdings. Solomon Price had made this deliberate choice when he restructured the company in 1986 after what he called the education, the year a competitor had obtained intelligence about his expansion plans through a mutual contact and used it to block his gate assignments at Atlanta's airport. Solomon had lost 8 months and nearly $2 million to that maneuver, and he had rebuilt everything he owned behind a structure that no one who was not specifically looking for it would find. Naomi had maintained the structure exactly as he left it, with 3 additions of her own: Camille Okafor as COO, Adiz Osi as general counsel, and the understanding, so deeply internalized she rarely needed to articulate it, that the building did not need to announce the airline. Because the airline announced itself every day in 60 aircraft across 42 cities. The Monday board meeting opened at 9. 12 members on secure video link from Atlanta, Houston, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. Naomi ran it standing because Solomon Price had never sat for a board meeting, and she had chosen to inherit that particular practice. She moved through the first 8 agenda items with the efficiency of someone whose preparation is invisible and whose decisions, when they come, are specific and final. The board had been working with her long enough to trust the brevity. She never said more than the situation required, and she always said everything the situation required. Adiz added item 9 at 8:57, 3 minutes before the meeting opened. When they reached it, Adiz said, "The Stokes Capital Supplemental FA filing, submitted Friday morning, names a new strategic co-investor in the proposed acquisition structure, Harriet Whitfield, through the Whitfield Family Trust. Projected equity stake of 23%, contingent on closing. The room, 12 faces on 12 screens, went quiet with the quality of people who process large information for a living, registering that this particular piece of information is large in a specific and personal way. Charles Beaumont, 19 years on the board, knew Solomon Price from 1978, looked at Naomi over his reading glasses with the expression of a man placing two facts next to each other. Harriet Whitfield, he said. My mother-in-law, Naomi said, soon to be former. Adazee laid the second document. The property at 1240 Peachtree Industrial Boulevard appears in the Stokes filing with an assigned valuation of $47 million. In our external audit, completed in April, prepared by Deloitte, the same property carries a valuation of $23 million. The discrepancy is $24 million, and the Stokes filing uses the inflated number as part of the acquisition price basis. A pause. The transmittal letter accompanying that filing carries Harriet Whitfield's signature. The room processed this in silence, the specific silence of 12 people doing separate calculations and arriving at the same understanding. Naomi said, she has been negotiating to buy this airline for 18 months. She submitted documentation to a federal regulatory agency that contains a $24 million valuation error, and she used that documentation as the foundation for a co-investment agreement with her own family trust. She looked at Adazee. When do we move? The referral package for the FA Legal Division and the SCC Atlanta Regional Office has been ready for 4 months, Adazee said. I am waiting for your instruction. Naomi looked at the board, at Charles Beaumont, at the tech entrepreneur who had joined 3 years ago and was still young enough to look surprised by things, at the woman in Houston who had been Solomon's operations chief for 14 years before Camille, and who was watching Naomi now with the expression of someone watching a thing she had been expecting for a long time finally arrive. Tuesday morning, Naomi said. 9 o'clock, she closed the meeting. The screens went dark. She sat alone in the conference room and looked at the photograph on the wall. Solomon Price at the ribbon cutting, his hand on the 7-year-old Naomi's shoulder, both of them looking toward something only he could see the shape of at the time. She had brought this photograph from her mother's house 3 years ago because she wanted something of his in the room where she made decisions. She had looked at it so often it had become furniture. She made herself look at it now. She thought about a Tuesday evening 3 years ago in Washington, D.C. She and Marcus had gone to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. After a conference dinner ran short, neither of them had planned it. They had simply found themselves with an open evening and had walked the 2 blocks and gone in. The galleries had been nearly empty by that hour. The crowds thinned to the people who come when a museum is quiet enough to actually look at things. They had moved through the aviation and technology section at the unhurried pace of people who had nowhere they needed to be, and Marcus had been reading the exhibit panels with the genuine focused attention he had when something interested him, not performing curiosity, but actually curious, asking her questions and listening to the answers. They had stopped in front of a display case containing artifacts from one of the early black aviation pioneers, his logbook, his instrument rating, a photograph of his first aircraft on a dirt strip in South Carolina. Marcus had read the name and said, I've never heard of this man. Naomi knew everything about that man. She knew his first solo flight date, the name of his flight instructor, the route he flew through the late 30s carrying mail between small southern cities in a Stinson Reliant. He maintained himself in a rented hangar because no established company would service his aircraft, and he had learned to do it himself rather than stop flying. She knew all of this because Solomon Price had talked about these men the way other fathers talked about athletes, with pride and specificity, and the private reverence of someone who understood that he was standing on what they had built. Marcus had turned to her with the engaged curiosity she loved in him. "How do you know all of this?" The words had assembled themselves completely. The full sentence ready. "Because my father kept a photograph of this man on his office wall for 30 years. Because he read me the history of black aviation the way other parents read bedtime stories. Because he built a company so that the generation after him would have a place to work instead of a world to fight against. And I have been running that company for 7 years." She had been a half second from saying it. The sentence was at the back of her teeth. A tour group had come around the corner, a family with children, the guide speaking in the practiced cadences of someone who loves what they are showing, and the moment fractured the way moments do when the external world inserts itself, and she had swallowed the sentence and said instead, "My father was interested in aviation history. He passed a lot of it on to me." Marcus had looked at her for a moment, half a second longer than the answer required, as though he had heard the shape of something larger behind it. Then the guide's voice drew his attention to the next exhibit, and Naomi had stood in the quiet of the gallery and felt the weight of the unsaid settle into its familiar place inside her, alongside all the other unsaids she had been carrying for 7 years, and thought, "Not yet. I'll know when it's time." She had been waiting for the right time for 3 years. She was done waiting. That night, Thursday, she sat in Jordan's room at her mother's house after he had fallen asleep in the chair by the window, listening to him breathe. His breathing and sleep had been the particular metric she had been monitoring for 11 months, attuned to any change the way a musician is attuned to a note going flat in a key they've known for years. His breathing was even. His face was unbothered. The paper airplane drawing was on the nightstand, soft from being folded and refolded and carried through a hospital stay. He stirred at 10:30, as he sometimes did, lighter sleep than a child his age should have, a side effect the doctors tracked. He opened his eyes and looked at her with the directness of a child who does not maintain the boundary between the waking and sleeping worlds. "Mama," he said, "is Daddy coming back?" She held her face. She had been carrying this question in her peripheral vision since the airport. She had known it was approaching, had prepared for it. What she had not fully prepared for was the quality of how he asked it. Not anxious, not with the performance of a child who wants to be reassured. Just focused and sincere, and needing the true thing so he could organize his world around it. "Your daddy loves you," she said. "That part doesn't change." Jordan looked at her with the patience of someone who has heard an answer that is true but incomplete. "That's not the same as coming back," he said. She looked at her son. She thought, "I would take every difficult thing I have ever faced twice over if it meant you did not have to carry this." She thought, "You ask me for the true thing, and you are going to get as much of the true thing as you are old enough to hold." "Some things are changing in our family," she said. "I'm going to be honest with you about that. But the changing is between me and Daddy. It's not about you. You are not the part that's changing." She paused. "You are the thing that stays the same." He thought about this. She waited. He said, "I'm the same?" "Yes." He thought a little longer. "Okay," he said, and closed his eyes. She stayed until his breathing evened into sleep. Then she went to the kitchen. Camille arrived the next morning at 9 with Vanessa Thornton, the chapter president who also happened to be a family law attorney, and Dr. Lydia Marsh, who had clerked for a federal judge 15 years ago, and whose opinions Camille had described accurately as worth having in the room. They came the way sorority sisters come when something matters, not with drama but with coffee in travel mugs and laptops already open, and the particular efficiency of women who have been trained by the same organization to provide what a serious situation requires without being asked to identify what that is. They sat at Solomon Price's kitchen table. Miss Eugenia put biscuits in the oven without ceremony and sat at the end with her crossword. Adiezy joined by phone. Vanessa had already reviewed the family court filing. "The motion is weak on its foundation," she said. "Undisclosed financial interests establishing potential instability. Judge Howell will require actual evidence of instability, not a theoretical concern. At a full hearing, this motion does not hold." She paused. "The hearing itself is the problem. Any active proceeding keeps Jordan's name in the public record while the regulatory situation develops." Adiezy said, "Two options. One, we contest the motion as filed. We stay anonymous. We let the process move at its own pace. 6 to 9 months. Jordan is a named party throughout." A pause. "Two, we file the ownership disclosure with the FAA and the SEC simultaneously. We remove the foundation the motion is relying on. Nothing is undisclosed anymore. The custody motion loses its basis. The acquisition terminates because the owner has come forward and is not selling." Another pause. "Both problems, one action," Camille said. "But you lose 7 years of quiet." Naomi looked at her. Then she looked at Vanessa, at Adiezy's name on the phone screen, at Dr. Marsh with her specific contained competence, at her mother at the end of the table, who had not looked up from her crossword, but whose hand had stopped moving. Miss Eugenia said, still not looking up, "Solomon built the quiet to protect what he built. He did not build it so it could be the thing that protected him forever at the cost of everything else." She filled in a word. "It has done its work. Let it be done." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the neighborhood, someone's radio was playing, something Naomi could not quite make out. "File Tuesday morning," she said, 9 o'clock. The women around the table did not celebrate. They understood that disclosure was not a magical victory. It meant press calls, questions about her marriage, scrutiny of every decision she had made, and strangers debating whether a woman who had protected a company for 7 years had deceived the people closest to her. It meant Naomi would no longer be able to move through airports as an anonymous executive or sit at a school fundraiser without someone measuring the price of her clothes against the value of the airline. Miss Eugenia closed her crossword. "Being seen is not the same as being exposed," she said. "Exposure is when somebody takes your truth and uses it against you. Being seen is when you stand inside your own truth and decide what it means." Naomi looked toward the living room where Jordan was explaining to a television pilot why the landing angle on the screen was too steep. "Then I am ready to be seen," she said. On Monday afternoon, she walked through the front entrance of Bridge Holdings instead of the private garage. Employees who had protected her anonymity for years looked up from reception desks and security stations. Camille stood beside the elevator with Adiezy. Neither woman announced her. They did not need to. Naomi stopped in the operations center where route maps covered one wall and live aircraft positions moved across another. Dispatchers, mechanics, customer care supervisors, and finance staff turned toward her. Some had known for years, some had suspected. A few learned the truth only when Camille sent the internal notice 15 minutes earlier. Naomi said, "My father built this company because he believed our children should never have to beg for a seat in an industry they helped create. I kept my ownership quiet to protect that work. Tomorrow the ownership becomes public because someone used my son's illness to threaten his place in my home. I will not allow anyone to use a child to steal the whole plane." No one applauded immediately. First, there was silence, the respectful silence of people understanding the cost inside the statement. Then Desmond, connected by video from Concourse D, placed one hand over his heart. Others followed. The gesture moved through the room without instruction. Naomi felt the weight of being seen and discovered it was not heavier than hiding. It was only different. Chapter 4. She owned the room and the truth. Tuesday morning. 7:41. Naomi stood at the mirror in the guest bedroom of her mother's house and looked at the person who was going to walk out the door in 20 minutes. She was wearing a dark plum suit, Solomon Price's favorite color on her, and he had told her once, when she was 23 and had just started working in his office for the summer, that plum was the color of a woman who already knew the outcome of the argument and was simply waiting for everyone else to arrive at it. The suit was not new. She had worn it to every significant meeting for 6 years, and it had acquired the quality that certain garments acquire when you have done important things in them, not sentimentality exactly, but the specific gravity of accumulated intention. She put on the flat black leather Oxfords her father had given her the afternoon she defended her dissertation in economics at Howard. Not the ceremony. The afternoon after the committee cleared the room and came back and said, yes. He had been waiting in the hallway with these shoes in a paper bag and had said, every time you walk into a room where something real is going to happen, I want you standing on solid ground. She had thought he meant traction. Later, she understood he meant something that had nothing to do with leather or rubber. She took her portfolio, one black case flat, nothing declarative, and she looked at herself for one moment without performance. Then she walked to the kitchen. Jordan was at the table with a bowl of cereal and his drawing, adding something to the airport scene with careful deliberateness. Miss Eugenia was at the stove with her coffee. When Naomi appeared in the doorway, her mother looked up and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her daughter the way a woman looks at the thing she has raised when she knows the thing is about to do something significant. I'll call when it's done, Naomi said. I'll be here, Miss Eugenia said. Go on. Adaisy transmitted the FA ownership declaration at 9:03. The SEC concurrent filing went at 9:07. Both received automated confirmation within minutes. At 9:14, Adaisy sent the package to 3 aviation trade publications under embargo until 11, Aviation Week, Airways Magazine, and the Atlanta Business Chronicle Aviation Desk. The sequencing was deliberate and based on a principle Solomon Price had used in 1994 when he expanded Skybridge's route network into 3 new markets and wanted the fact established in the regulatory record before any competitor could move to challenge it. Let the legal truth land first. Then let the information carry itself. Naomi was already in the elevator. The lobby of Stokes Capitol Tower was polished and hushed in the way of buildings that charge enough for their spaces to buy silence. The reception staff were good at their jobs, which meant they were good at reading situations. Naomi walked to the elevator bank without stopping. The receptionist watched her and said nothing, which was the correct read. 32nd floor. The corridor had the temporary, over-prepared quality of a space set up for an occasion, water pitchers on a rolling cart, printed agendas on a side table. The particular smell of a room aired in advance of important people. Through the glass wall of the conference room, she counted 10 people. Harriet Whitfield at the head of the table in dark green, silver earrings, the settled posture of a woman who has been the most important person in a great many rooms and has made her peace with the furniture. 3 Stokes Capitol attorneys to her right. 2 board members she recognized from public filings, Preston Cole, the M&A director, and Victoria Hale on the left side. Victoria wore the same cream coat from the airport, but the confidence inside it had changed. At the far right, one chair was pulled back from the table at a slight angle, present but apart. Marcus. She had not known he would be here. She had considered the possibility and had decided she could not plan for everything Marcus did. Because Marcus's decisions were genuinely his own, even the ones shaped by his mother's preparation of the landscape around him. She pushed open the door. Preston Cole looked up. I believe this is an internal. I am the authorized representative of the controlling party of Bridge Holdings, Naomi said. She walked to the empty chair at the far end of the table, opposite Harriet, and sat down. She opened her portfolio and centered a document packet on the table within reach of anyone who wanted to pick it up. And I am the controlling party. The room changed the way rooms change when the atmospheric pressure shifts, not dramatically, but completely and immediately. Harriet Whitfield had trained her face across 40 years of rooms exactly like this one. What happened in the 3 seconds after Naomi sat down was not a loss of control. It was something more careful, a rapid internal recalibration. The quality of a very good card player who has just understood that one of the cards they thought they held is not in their hand. She looked at Naomi. She looked at the document packet. She said, "Naomi," one word. They wait of a woman deciding what the word means. Mrs. Whitfield. Full title, formal register, which in this context was not courtesy but positioning. Before we discuss acquisition structure, I'd like to address the valuation discrepancy in your FAA filing. The property at 1240 Peachtree Industrial Boulevard appears in your filing at $47 million. Our external audit, Deloitte, April of this year, carries the same property at $23 million. That is a $24 million gap on a single line item. Naomi kept her voice even and specific, without performance. The FA Legal Division and the SEC Atlanta office received our documentation at 9:03 and 9:07 this morning, respectively. One of the attorneys said, "Any discrepancy in the filing would be a technical matter for the respective financial teams, too. The transmittal letter is on page 4 of the packet," Naomi said, under Mrs. Whitfield's signature. Harriet set her hand flat on the table, her move, her long-practiced move, the gesture of a woman re-establishing her authority in a room that has begun to slide away from her. She said, "Naomi, I want to be very careful here. You are a respondent in an active family court proceeding. Walking into a major corporate transaction in that posture, executing business interests while you are in a custody dispute over your son, that is a complicated position to put yourself in." The warmth in her voice was real, which was the most dangerous thing about it. "I would not want this to create an appearance problem for you in front of Judge Howell." Naomi had expected this. She had expected it because it was the move available to someone who had just lost the financial ground and needed to shift the terrain before the room processed what had happened. The move was, use Jordan, use the court proceeding, use the framing of motherly concern. "My attorney filed an amended financial disclosure with Judge Howell's clerk this morning at 8:45, Naomi said. The disclosure includes the full Bridge Holdings asset schedule and the ownership declaration. Judge Howell has a complete picture of my financial position." She looked at Harriet directly, which is more than Stokes Capital's institutional investors currently have regarding the leverage profile of this firm. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be walked back. Harriet did not respond immediately. For the first time in Naomi's 7 years of knowing her, Harriet Whitfield sat in a professional setting and did not find the next word in under 2 seconds. Victoria reached for the ownership schedule before Marcus did. Her eyes stopped on the first page, where Naomi Solomon Price was listed as controlling shareholder with 68% voting authority. The blood left her face in a slow, visible retreat. "You knew," Victoria said, but she was not speaking to Naomi. She was speaking to Harriet. Harriet did not look at her. "I knew there were undisclosed interests. You told the acquisition team the owner was an offshore consortium. This is not the time." Victoria closed the packet. She looked at Marcus, and for the first time, the future she had imagined beside him appeared less like romance and more like a room Harriet had arranged for both of them. She moved her chair several inches away. Marcus reached for the document packet. He pulled it toward him. He turned to page 4 and found the transmittal letter and read it the way he had been reading things since Tuesday morning, making himself actually absorb what was there instead of moving past the part that would require something difficult of him. Then he went back to the front and read the property section. He read the two numbers side by side, 47 million in the Stokes filing, 23 million in the Deloitte audit. Same address, same building, $24 million between them. He set the packet down. He looked at his mother. The Peachtree industrial valuation, he said. The 47 million. Who authorized that number? Harriet's chin lifted a degree. The finance team assembled the acquisition package. Your signature is on page 4, Marcus said. He said it the way he said difficult things when he was being very careful with himself, level, unhurried. The voice of a man managing his own register because he knows what it sounds like when it gets away from him. I'm looking at it right now. Who authorized the 47 million? The word came then, the one she had not planned for. The one that arrived in a register he had not used with her in a professional setting in 20 years. Mom. Not Mrs. Whitfield, not even mother. Mom. Spoken without sharpness, without accusation, with something harder than either. The directness of a man who has stopped managing the distance between the person he loves and the thing he needs to understand. Harriet looked at her son. Something moved across her face that was not her trained professional expression, something older and more tired. She said, "This is not the conversation we should be having in front of. It's the only conversation I'm interested in right now," Marcus said. The silence that followed lasted 8 seconds. In a different room, it might have passed quickly. In this room, with 9 people and 1 open window, and the morning light cutting across the mahogany table, all 8 of those seconds were present and accounted for. Marcus set the packet down. "My mother gave me selected documents," he said. His voice was quiet, but every person at the table heard it. "She gave me the weapon. I was the one who aimed it at my wife and my son. I signed the custody petition. That betrayal belongs to me." Harriet turned toward him. "Marcus, be careful. I was careful at the airport. I was careful when Jordan asked why I did not visit. I was careful while I let attorneys turn his illness into leverage. Careful is the word I used when I was being a coward." He took out his phone and called his attorney in front of the room. "Withdraw the emergency motion today. No conditions. File a statement that the financial documents were incomplete and that I no longer support the claims. Send confirmation to Naomi's counsel before noon." Harriet's control broke by only a fraction. "You are making a permanent decision in an emotional moment." Marcus looked at her. "No. I made the permanent decision on Friday when I signed it. This is the first honest thing I have done since." One of the 2 Stokes board members cleared his throat. "We also need to address the regulatory exposure and Mrs. Whitfield's role while the inquiry is active." Harriet looked at him as if he had spoken out of turn in her house. "There is no established violation. There is a signed filing with a $24 million discrepancy," he said. "Our lenders will ask whether management controls failed or whether management directed the number. Until we know which, the board has a duty to act." The second board member opened a folder that had been waiting near her chair. "I move that Harriet Whitfield take immediate administrative leave as chair and chief executive pending independent review." For 30 years, rooms had waited for Harriet to speak. This one moved before she gave permission. The motion was seconded. Preston Cole's phone buzzed. He looked at it. He placed it face down. He looked at Harriet with the expression of a man managing a situation he no longer believed he controlled. "Aviation Week has broken embargo," he said. "Skybridge Airlines has published an ownership confirmation. And First Southern Bank has suspended the unused portion of Stokes Capital's revolving credit line pending review." The first consequence landed before Harriet could finish calculating the first. The board voted 7-2 for immediate administrative leave. Harriet did not vote. The bylaws did not permit the subject of the motion to decide whether the motion applied to her. Victoria stood and collected her red portfolio. She looked at Marcus. "I believed the version of your marriage that made me feel innocent," she said. "That was convenient for both of us. I will cooperate with the internal review. Do not call me tonight." She left without waiting for Harriet's permission. An attorney asked Harriet to surrender her company access card before the close of business. No one raised a voice. No one needed to. The quiet was more final than humiliation performed for an audience. For 30 years, every room had waited for Harriet Whitfield to speak. That morning, the meeting continued after the door closed behind her. The phones in the room registered the news one by one. Each person checked a screen and then looked toward Naomi. The woman Stokes Capital had negotiated around for 18 months without understanding that she controlled the answer. Harriet remained at the head of the table for the final minutes allowed to her, looking like a woman who had spent 40 years reading rooms and had finally entered one that could continue without her. At 10:48, Desmond Okafor read the ownership notice in the employee break room at Concourse D. Gate agents, mechanics, and ground crew gathered around his phone. "Miss Price is officially on the record," he said. Charlene, 14 years with Skybridge, set down her coffee. "I knew it from the way she walked through this terminal. She never looked at anything like it belonged to somebody else." Desmond remembered Jordan's paper airplane and the quiet recognition beneath Solomon Price's bronze name. He raised his cup. Everyone in the room raised whatever they were holding. No reporter saw it. Naomi never heard about it. The gesture still mattered. Naomi closed her portfolio. She stood. She addressed the room, the attorneys, the board members, Preston Cole, without directing it at anyone specifically, and therefore without letting anyone avoid it. Skybridge Airlines is not pursuing any ownership change in the current fiscal year. You will hear from our legal team regarding the FAA documentation. She nodded once. She walked to the door. The hallway outside the conference room was empty. She pressed the elevator call button. She heard the conference room door open behind her and did not turn around. Marcus came and stood beside her. Not in front of her, not between her and the elevator, beside her, at the distance of someone who is not assuming closeness but is not performing a distance he does not feel. The elevator came. The doors opened. He did not step through. She looked at him. 3 seconds. He was standing in the hallway of a building where everything had just shifted, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has things he needs to say and has understood, in this moment, that not one of them is the right thing for right now. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. She stood in the downward motion and allowed herself to breathe. For the first time since she had walked through those conference room doors, with the full capacity of her lungs. At 6:14 that evening, her phone rang from a number her attorney had told her to expect. She let it ring twice. The attorney said his client had authorized withdrawal of the emergency custody motion, effective first thing Wednesday morning. The formal filing would include a statement identifying financial misrepresentation in the prior documentation as a contributing factor to the original motion, and the statement would name the source of the misrepresentation specifically. She sat in the parking garage under the Bridge Holdings building with the engine off, the concrete and the dim light and the smell of fuel, the particular anonymous infrastructure that holds up everything that moves. He also asked me to convey something, the attorney said, directly. He said, I should have asked the questions years ago. I'm sorry that I didn't, she said. Thank you for the call. She sat there for a long time, in the quiet of that garage, with the weight of a Tuesday in October, settling around her what it had cost, what it had cleared, what was still unresolved and was going to take time, that she was now, for the first time in 7 years, prepared to give it. She picked up the phone and called her mother. "It's done," she said. "Jordan wants to show you the control tower," Miss Eugenia said. He added windows and people in the windows. She started the engine. "Tell him the people need names," she said. She heard her mother relay this to Jordan. She heard the sound of a 7-year-old boy receiving a creative directive he considered both correct and overdue. She drove south. Chapter 5. She stopped making herself smaller. Harriet came on Thursday evening, not Wednesday. Wednesday would have looked like panic, like a woman who had not yet finished calculating. Not Friday. Friday would have looked like she had accepted something. Thursday was the precise calibration of someone who needed to make one more move and had taken 2 days to decide on the form it would take. She parked in front of the house on Cascade Hills Road at 623. The house was white-painted brick with azalea bushes along the front walk and a porch light burning against the darkening October evening. It was a modest house in the accurate sense of that word, the house of a woman who had spent 40 years teaching school and had no interest in the building she lived in making any kind of statement about her, because she had spent those 40 years making statements that required no architecture. Solomon Price had bought it in 1974 for $32,000 and had come home to it every evening for 22 years. Every person in Cascade Heights who had known him understood that the house was, in some way that had nothing to do with the deed, still his. Harriet rang the bell. Miss Eugenia opened the door. House clothes, pale blue button front dress, reading glasses pushed up on her head. She stood in her own doorway with the particular stillness of a woman who is constitutionally incapable of being unsettled by a visitor on her porch. "Harriet," she said. "Eugenia, I'd like to speak with Naomi." "I know you would," Miss Eugenia said. She did not move. Naomi came from the hallway. She came and stood beside her mother in the doorframe, not behind her, not stepping in front of her. Beside her, 2 women in the same frame at the entrance of the same house, which said everything necessary about whose house this was. Jordan was in the living room, audible through the wall, the particular soundtrack of a 7-year-old, and what sounded like a documentary about migration. She had told him she had a work conversation, and he had accepted this and gone back to his drawing with the focused equanimity of a child who has learned that adults have work conversations that are none of his immediate business. "Come in," Naomi said. They sat at the kitchen table. Adaze was in the corner chair with a legal pad. Miss Eugenia put the kettle on without ceremony because it was her kitchen and that was what her kitchen required, and then sat at the end of the table and picked up her crossword. Harriet tried the first approach, a business arrangement. Stokes Capital would take no further legal action in the family court proceedings. The withdrawal had already been filed. That was settled if Naomi would agree not to push the SEC on the valuation discrepancy. "There are ways to resolve this quietly," she said, "that serve everyone's interests, including Jordan's." The SEC inquiry was opened. Tuesday morning, Adaze said from the corner, not looking up, before anyone in this room had spoken to anyone in this room. Harriet absorbed this without visible reaction. She moved to the second approach, the Atlanta community. The 30-year history of Stokes Capital's relationships in the city's black business networks, the complexity of a prolonged public conflict between 2 families who had each built real things. She said all of this with genuine feeling, because she was not wrong that such conflicts carry costs, and she was not wrong that some of those costs would fall on people who deserved better. Naomi said, "I filed legal documents in the appropriate regulatory channels. If there are public consequences, they come from what those documents contained, not from anything I have said publicly, because I have not said anything publicly." The third approach was Jordan. which was the approach Harriet had known she would need to use and had been saving for the moment when the other two had not worked. She said it quietly, without drama. A 7-year-old child needed stability. An active legal conflict between his parents and their extended families was not stability. Whatever had happened between the adults, the child's well-being had to be the first consideration. Jordan's well-being, Naomi said, has been my first consideration since the first morning we sat in a specialist's office and heard the diagnosis. It was my first consideration 3 days ago when his inflammation was bad enough for a second hospitalization in 4 months. It was my first consideration on the morning you and Marcus chose for this conversation when I had spent 72 hours in a hospital room with my son. She paused. Jordan's well-being is not available to be used as a negotiating instrument. Harriet was quiet. She opened her handbag as if one more document might change the room, then closed it again. Every business argument had failed. Every legal threat had already been answered. Then she looked at the wall, and something happened that none of the 3 women in the room were quite prepared for, because it was not a calculated move, and therefore was the most surprising thing Harriet Whitfield had done since she arrived. She looked at the wall the way a person looks at something that is not there, inward at something only they can see. And in that moment, she was not the woman who had built Stokes Capital from a glass-walled closet and 2 associates and a full calendar. She was a woman who had built something real and had done something in the service of protecting it that had taken from her the very thing she had built it to protect. The moment passed. She began to stand. Miss Eugenia did something then. She set down her crossword pencil. She stood from her chair, not quickly, not with drama, with the deliberateness of a woman who has decided that something needs to be said by her specifically and is prepared to stand for it. She walked to the wall where the photograph hung, Solomon Price at the ribbon cutting, his 7-year-old daughter beside him. She turned to face Harriet. In 1986, she said, a man named Caldwell decided he wanted what Solomon had built. He got access to our financing structure through someone Solomon trusted. He used it to block 3 gate assignments at this airport. We lost 8 months and almost $2 million. And for 3 weeks, I did not know if we were going to keep this house. She looked at the photograph, then at Harriet, without anger, with something cleaner than anger. Solomon rebuilt everything he owned behind walls nobody could see through. He taught Naomi to do the same because he loved his daughter and he could not stand the thought of her paying the price he had paid. She looked at Harriet directly. You are a woman who built something real. I am not in the business of ignoring that. But you came to the building with Solomon Price's name on the wall, and you handed his daughter a folder designed to take her child from her. You sat in a hospital room with that child while you were building the case to use against his mother. She paused, and now you are standing in Solomon Price's house, using Solomon Price's memory to ask his daughter for a favor. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. I am asking you to understand what you have done in this name and in this house, and to take that understanding home with you. Harriet stood at the table of a house that was not hers, looking at a woman who was not impressed by the suit or the earrings or the 30 years, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse, and Harriet Whitfield had always known when a room had ended. She picked up her handbag. She looked at Naomi. One last look, the kind with several things in it at once, none of them simple. Then she walked to the door. Before Harriet reached the door, she turned once. Are you trying to destroy me? Naomi answered without hesitation. No. I am going to stop saving you from what you did. Harriet's eyes moved to Miss Eugenia, perhaps looking for mercy from one mother to another. Miss Eugenia said, Mercy does not require my daughter to carry your consequences. Harriet left. She went down the porch steps and along the azalea path without looking back. Naomi and Miss Eugenia stood in the doorframe and watched her go, and neither of them closed the door. The October night air moved around them. The car at the curb started. Harriet Whitfield rounded the corner and was gone. Miss Eugenia picked up her crossword and went back to her chair. Jordan said something in the living room in response to the television, an observation delivered to the air about wherever the animals in the documentary were migrating toward. Daisy closed her legal pad. Naomi stood in the kitchen doorway and let herself breathe. Later, after Daisy left and Jordan fell asleep, Naomi went into the small room that had once been Solomon's study. His desk remained against the wall, scarred near the right corner where he had dropped a metal toolbox in 1982 and refused to replace the wood because, he said, a desk that had done real work should be allowed to look like it. Naomi closed the door. She removed her wedding ring and held it in her palm. For 7 years, it had represented a promise she kept even while hiding parts of herself. Now it represented a marriage Marcus had placed beneath his signature on a custody petition. She did not throw it. She did not crush it into a drawer. She placed it in the center of her father's desk and sat in his chair. Miss Eugenia opened the door without knocking. She looked at the ring and then at her daughter. "Baby," she said, "you do not have to be strong in an empty room." Naomi's face folded before she could stop it. She cried for the hospital nights Marcus missed, for Jordan's question at the gate, for the woman she had edited into something easier to love, and for the father who had taught her how to protect a company, but had died before teaching her what to do when protection became loneliness. Miss Eugenia held her without offering a lesson. Some pain did not need to become wisdom while it was still pain. When Naomi finally lifted her head, she looked at the ring on the desk. "The marriage is over," she said. Her mother nodded. "Then let it be over without letting it tell you that you failed." Naomi left the ring where it was. The call from Camille came at 10 the next morning. The Philadelphia appointment, Camille said, with the specific quality of measured calm she used when there was a problem with a solution she has already partially identified. Jefferson's billing ran the insurance authorization this morning. Jordan's primary coverage is through Marcus's employment benefits plan. The plan administrator is Whitfield Family Medical Trust. There's a hold on the trust account, part of the broader financial review following the Stokes situation. It's not deliberate, probably, but it's there. Insurance authorization from that account is estimated to take 3 to 4 weeks to clear. Jordan's appointment was in 6 weeks. If authorization took 4, the cushion Dr. Watkins had said they needed would be days, not margin, days. Naomi sat at her mother's kitchen table and was quiet for one moment, not because she did not know what to do, but because she had learned from Solomon Price that the moment between identifying a problem and acting on it was worth taking slowly to make sure you were solving the right thing and not just the loudest one. She was solving this. Her son needed that appointment to hold. She had the means to hold it. The question was only which means. "Daisy," she said. On the line, Daisy said from the background of Camille's call, "Jordan is enrolled in the Skybridge Community Health Partnership as a dependent under my employee status. Since the week he came home from the hospital," Daisy said. "You added him to the policy when he was 8 days old. Comprehensive coverage, including specialist referral authorization. Then we designate the Skybridge policy as primary, Whitfield plan as secondary pending hold clearance. The authorization goes through Skybridge's plan administrator, not the trust account. That removes the hold from the equation entirely." A pause. "I can have the paperwork to Jefferson's billing department within the hour," Daisy said. "Do it." She hung up the phone and sat for a moment with her coffee. She thought about Solomon Price adding her name to his company's benefits list when she was born, setting up the coverage in advance of the need, the way he did everything, building the structure before you knew you were going to need the structure. She thought about Jordan in his hospital room, reaching for navy blue and old gold crayons. She thought about the particular way that certain kinds of care work quietly in the background before you know you will need them, waiting there when the moment comes. Jefferson Hospital's billing department received the authorization at 11:47. Jordan's appointment was confirmed and held at 11:51. That afternoon, Naomi called Camille and asked for a proposal. Skybridge already funded specialist referrals for employees and community partners. Naomi wanted the program expanded into the Solomon Price Children's Health Network, with transportation, lodging, and specialist access for families whose children needed treatment outside their home state. "This is not a press response," Naomi said. "No launch event built around Jordan, no photographs of him in a hospital. Build it so another mother does not have to choose between keeping her job and taking her child to a doctor 3 states away." Camille was quiet for a moment. "Your father would understand that." "My father built planes to bring people home," Naomi said. "We can use them to bring children where they need to go." The board approved the first $20 million the following week. Naomi required the program to publish outcomes, not family pain. The decision became the first public act she made under her own name after the ownership disclosure. She did not tell him about the problem. He was 7 years old. What he needed to know was that the appointment was happening and that the doctor in Philadelphia was going to help figure out the next part of the plan for his body. She told him this, and he received it with the serious, focused attention he gave information that was important and real. Then he went back to his airport drawing, which now had a control tower with 17 named people in the windows, and a runway extension he had decided was aerodynamically necessary. 2 weeks after the boardroom, Marcus found her at Children's Healthcare on a Saturday afternoon. Not entirely by plan, he had known the follow-up appointment was on the calendar, and he had made a decision about it, and then he had driven himself there and found her coming out of the exam room with Jordan and his 4 stickers and his Saturday afternoon energy. Jordan saw his father and went directly to him in the uncomplicated way of a child who has sorted his feelings from the adult complications and decided to proceed with the people he loves as the people he loves until told otherwise. Marcus crouched down and held his son, and Jordan told him everything: the blood work, the 4 stickers, the specific fish sticker he had selected with particular intentionality, Dr. Reeves in Philadelphia in 4 weeks, and the fact that his drawing now had 17 named people in the control tower windows, and he was thinking of adding a second terminal. Marcus listened to all of it. When Jordan ran down, Marcus asked the nurse on duty if Jordan could look through the sticker collection in the supply room. He had spotted it, he said, when they were walking out, and the nurse said yes, and Jordan went in with the focused enthusiasm of a child offered access to stickers, and Marcus stood up and turned to Naomi. She watched him come down the hallway. She saw the coat he was wearing, not the new gray one, but the older brown one, the familiar one, the one he had worn to Jordan's first baseball game and to her mother's Thanksgiving 3 years in a row. She registered that choice without commenting on it. He stopped a few feet from her. His shoulders were slightly forward, the posture she knew from 7 years of living with a person, the way he held himself when he was working towards something he was not certain of. He said, "I know I should have called. I kept telling myself I would, and then I kept finding a reason why today wasn't the right day." He paused. "Then this morning I understood that waiting for the right day was just another way of not coming." She said, "I appreciate you being here for Jordan." He heard the precision of it. He heard the specific thing that was and was not being said. He started again. and the second version was different because he stopped protecting himself in the sentence. I know I don't have standing to ask for anything from you. I know what I signed my name to, and I know why I signed it, and the why is the part I'm going to have to sit with for a long time, because it's not a reason I can make external. It's mine. A pause. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness right now. I just needed to not be the person who didn't show up. She looked at him. This was different from the first thing he had said. This one she could hear. Tell me the thing you actually want to say, she said. He was quiet for a moment with the quality of a person who is choosing to say the true thing instead of the prepared thing. I've been thinking about the night at the museum, he said. The aviation gallery. I knew, standing there, that you knew more than you were saying. I knew it at the time. He paused. I told myself it was your privacy. I told myself I respected that. But the honest thing is that I was also afraid. Afraid that if I pushed, I would find out you had a whole life I knew nothing about, and then I would have to decide what that meant, and the deciding would require me to do something hard. He looked at his hands, then at her. It was easier not to push. I am not proud of that, she said. It was easier for me not to tell you. My father's lesson is real. I mean that. But that was not the only reason I kept it quiet. She looked at him steadily. I did not know if you wanted to know me. Not what I had. Not what I'd built. Me, the full version, without the editing. And I was afraid of what it would mean if you looked at all of it, and it still wasn't enough to make you stay and look. He said, I wanted to know you. I do want to know you. A pause. I just didn't know how to say that without it sounding like I was asking you for something. You were asking me for something. Yes, he said, I was. The hallway was the particular quiet of a place that is fully occupied with the business of keeping people alive. The hum of machines, the sound of a building doing its necessary work. They stood in it without filling it, which was its own kind of change. From the 7 years they had spent filling silences with the careful management of what was said and not said. I have decided one thing, she said. The marriage we had is over. You do not get it back because you withdrew the weapon after using it. Marcus absorbed the words without defending himself. I understand. There may be a future in which I trust you as Jordan's father. Do not confuse that with the marriage you destroyed. I will not. Jordan needs his father. That part is not complicated. You will attend the medical appointments. You will learn his medications. You will stop allowing your mother, your attorneys, or your fear to interpret your son for you. The rest is your work, and I will not supervise it. Marcus nodded. I will keep showing up. Then show up when nobody is watching, and when there is nothing you can gain. That is the only apology I am prepared to measure, he said. That is more than I expected you to offer. Do not make it more than it is, she said. I won't. He met her eyes. I promise. Jordan came back from the supply room with what appeared to be 8 stickers in total, 4 on his hand and 4 distributed across his shirt in a pattern that suggested both intention and improvisation, and looked between his parents with the assessing look of a child who has decided to accept what is in front of him without requiring it to be something else. Are you guys talking about me? He said. No, they both said at exactly the same time. Jordan narrowed his eyes very slightly, the way a child does when 2 adults say something simultaneously, and he knows what that usually means. He decided to let it go. He held up his hand. Daddy, I got a fish and an astronaut and a basketball and a dinosaur. Marcus studied the stickers with full attention. The fish and the astronaut are clearly the strongest choices, he said. That's what I thought, Jordan agreed. 4 weeks later, Gate D14, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, 7:22 in the morning. Jordan was in the boarding line in his gray zip-up hoodie and his sneakers and his backpack with the small embroidered patch he had added himself, a paper airplane in navy blue on a dark background. because he had decided his backpack should reflect his interests, and this was a decision he was prepared to defend. He was holding his boarding pass in both hands with the careful regard of someone who understands that this document has a job to do, and he intends to let it do that job. Francis, lead flight attendant, 18 years with Sky Bridge, had seen a great many things pass through the boarding door of Concourse D and was not easily moved by most of them. She looked at Jordan's boarding pass as he reached the front of the line. She read the name, Jordan Price Whitfield. She looked up at the woman standing just behind him. To the left, dark plum coat, flat black shoes, the particular quality of presence that belongs to someone who is done making herself smaller than she is. Frances had known who Naomi Price Whitfield was for 6 years. She had known it the way the people who work closest to a thing know what the thing is and who it belongs to, not from an announcement, but from the cumulative evidence of how a company runs, the decisions it makes, the values that show up consistently in the places where values either show up or don't. She looked at the boarding pass. She looked at Naomi, she said, with the warmth of someone who means exactly what they say without embellishment. "We'll take good care of him, Miss Price." Jordan looked at his mother when Francis said this. He looked at the boarding pass in his hands. He read his own name, both names, all of it, the full inheritance of the person he was becoming. He looked back at Naomi with an expression that said he was putting things together. Not all the things, the important ones. "Mama," he said. "Yes, baby. Is this your airplane?" She looked at her son, at the backpack with the paper airplane patch and the hospital bracelet long since gone, and the way he held things now that he had decided mattered. She looked at the boarding pass with his name on it. "This is our airplane, Jordan," she said. "Yours and mine and your grandfather's. We just share it with a lot of other people." He thought about this. He nodded, satisfied with the answer in the way he was satisfied when something true was offered to him simply. He stepped through the gate. She watched him go, the gray hoodie and the backpack patch, and the careful way he held the boarding pass until he absolutely had to hand it over. And she felt something settle in her chest that was large and warm and specific, the feeling that belongs to a thing that has been working toward rightness for a long time and has arrived. Marcus was beside her. He had called and asked the day before if he could come, and she had said yes, and he had come and stood beside her on the correct side of the gate without crowding her or performing anything or asking for more than she had offered. He was wearing the brown coat she had noticed when he got out of his car. Jordan reached the jet bridge and turned back. He was grinning, the full, uncomplicated grin of a child who is about to board a plane to a new city to see a doctor who is going to help, and whose parents are both at the gate to watch him go. He waved with both hands, the wide, enthusiastic wave of someone who has not yet learned that enthusiasm is a thing adults learn to modulate. Naomi raised her hand. Beside her, without discussion or coordination, Marcus raised his. They waved at the same moment, at the same child, standing several feet apart under the Solomon Price Concourse placard, the name in bronze that Jordan had read 6 weeks ago and matched to the colors in his drawing without anyone telling him to. A woman and a man with 7 years of marriage and 1 week of truth and 4 weeks of careful, uncertain work between them, standing together under the name of the man who had built this terminal and taught his daughter to protect what mattered, and had also, in the end, understood that protection was not the same as hiding, and that the things worth keeping had eventually to be brought into the light. Jordan went through the jet bridge. The gate agent scanned the final pass. The door closed. They stood at the window. The aircraft pulled back from the gate, navy blue and old gold, the livery bright in the morning, the engines beginning their particular low tone that Naomi had known since she was small enough to feel it in her sternum on an observation deck beside her father. She watched the aircraft turn on the ground cruise signal, slow and sure, onto the taxiway. She had been coming to this terminal her whole life. She had been invisible in this terminal for 7 years. She was done with both. "He'll be good," Marcus said. "He'll be great," she said. The aircraft reached the runway. The engines lifted, and the plane carrying her father's colors and her son's name rose into the Atlanta morning. It climbed through the cloud layer until only blue sky remained. Marcus stood several feet away, close enough to be Jordan's father, and far enough to respect what he had broken. Naomi did not need to know what came next between them. For the first time, uncertainty did not feel like danger. It felt like a future she was free to choose. She had protected the airline. She had protected her son. Now she was finally protecting the woman who had built both a company and a life, while asking the world for permission to notice neither. Naomi Price turned from the window beneath her father's name. She did not hide behind Marcus's surname, Solomon's shadow, or the silence that had once kept her safe. She walked through her own terminal fully seen.